This is a review of the 1965 Sidney Pollack film The Slender Thread, starring Sidney Poitier, Anne Bancroft, and Telly Savalas. This is a movie about a college student at the University of Washington trying to study for his finals, at least trying to study for his finals while he is on a shift, watching the phones, listening to the phones for the newly formed Seattle Crisis Clinic. There's an incoming call from Anne Bancroft, a woman who is on the verge of taking her own life, and over the phone they discuss the events. There's a bunch of interesting things to think about with this movie. I would say overall, this movie is maybe slightly overlong, but it's pretty cool, especially if you are interested in the history of Seattle at all, or are from the area, or if you really like telephones. The movie has pretty extensive aerial footage of Chicago, of Seattle. It opens up with the Space Needle, which was relatively new at the time. Some scenes filmed outside of the Pacific Science Center and whatnot. It's really filmed on location. It gets a pretty good sense of the place and the time. There's also pretty extensive use of a telephone, but also pretty extensive view into some of the behind the scenes of telephone switchboards and operations, which is pretty cool. But we'll get to that. Anne Bancroft, Sidney Poitier, both phenomenal actors who both do a phenomenal job in this movie. Electrifying is probably a good word. Sidney Poitier is sometimes a somewhat controversial actor in some ways because, he was really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. Some people criticize the characters that he played as being it's sort of playing into respectability politics. The idea that there's only one way to assimilate as a black person in the U.S., which is to act like a white person. And that is an idea that's not very popular now, but that some of his movies espouse to some degree, which probably is not something we should blame him for so much as the white directors and screenwriters who wrote these movies. This movie falls into that trap a little bit. Sidney Poitier's character, Alan Newell, this character's name, is a very upstanding, studious student. They go maybe a little bit too far in showing us exactly how studious he is at the beginning. There's one scene where he literally has a pencil behind his ear, which is maybe a bit ham-fisted. But in general, this movie is not... Don't file in the same categories you might file his most famous movies, like In the Heat of the Night or Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which are very much morality plays about race. This movie has some racial undertones, but it is not a morality play about race, and it's kind of cool just to see a movie that could have had an actor, a white actor, playing the main character that has Sidney Poitier in it instead. That is, I think, a pretty cool way to expand the horizons of Hollywood in the 60s. And he does a phenomenal job because Sidney Poitier, regardless of whatever ideological snags there may be with some of his movies, he is a phenomenal actor. He's still alive, but I'm not sure if he's acting so much now. Like I said, there are a couple of racial undertones in this movie. For instance, there's a moment when Sidney Poitier is just talking to Anne Bancroft and telling her that he understands what it means to be overlooked every day, things like that, or to be looked at from the corner of your eye, and things like that. There are also a couple of moments where Anne Bancroft mentions, why weren't you here earlier today? And you sort of wonder at times what would happen if their characters were to meet in real life, and there is just a hint of a little bit of a romantic relationship. Not exactly, but some sort of mild romantic thing going on, and this possibility that they might meet off the phone in real life. And that kind of begs the question about race a little bit, because it's not exactly clear what would happen. So you wonder if the movie is sort of sweeping. The risk maybe would be that the movie just sort of sweeps the complexity that Alan Newell being black would bring to that situation under the rug, and is just sort of pretending like, it doesn't matter, it's all good, see, he's a great guy and everybody totally accepts him and it's no problem. The movie doesn't really fall into that track, but there's maybe some risk. Like I said, for the most part, this is not really a movie about race. It's a movie where any character could have played the lead, and it's kind of cool to see a phenomenal black actor do the job. So another main big thing to address about this movie is suicide and its portrayal in film. Hollywood has sort of an interesting track record with suicide and depression. And, in the early years, from the 30s to the late 50s or early 60s, the production code, Hays Code, was in effect in Hollywood, which explicitly forbade characters from committing suicide to escape a problem created in the plot. So you couldn't have, if you're ever wondering, if you're ever watching a 1940s or 50s movie where a character seems like they might commit suicide, and that will be the end of the movie, well, spoiler, they don't, because you couldn't make a movie like that, or it wouldn't be approved for distribution, at least at major theater chains and such. So that doesn't give you a lot of room in those decades to really address the issue, and there aren't tons of movies that do. Even once you start seeing in the 60s and later on depression and suicide become more talked about in movies, I think one of the big pitfalls that a lot of movies fall into is that they need to assign a cause to depression or to suicide. There's a bit of a scavenger hunt. Why did they do it? Kind of thing that goes on. That's just a classic narrative trait, almost maybe even borrowed from police procedurals or detective films of the 40s, where there's some sort of mystery. You're trying to figure out why was someone murdered or something like that, and people sort of copied that approach onto movies about depression or suicide, and there's this hunt for why it happened. And I think maybe today we would not be so quick to assign depression to one sort of traumatic incident, although perhaps that does happen. But maybe it's not always one specific incident, one dramatic plot element that leads someone to feeling depressed. There could be a broad range of scenarios and circumstances and whatnot, or there could be things that are just don't really fit the mold of something that you could discover as the answer to a mystery, build up a plot around understanding. And we also, I think, now maybe understand more that just getting to that answer of why it is doesn't resolve the issue, mostly. So this movie has a bit of a contrived plot element for why Anne Bancroft's character is contemplating suicide. And it's not terrible. I mean, it's just kind of a run-of-the-mill plot. I will say that they do a pretty good job of showing her story through flashbacks. So most of the movie shows Sidney Poitier talking on the phone with Anne Bancroft. But there's also, maybe half of it is that. And then the other half is shown in flashback, which shows Anne Bancroft's character going about her life, and you learn this issue, which I won't spoil what that is. If you're curious, you can watch the movie. But it's related to the family, which is I think particularly significant. There's another risk too. If this movie I think had come out about 10 years earlier, then we probably would have still been in the phase where depression or suicidal tendencies in women would be described as hysteria or weakness in sort of movies from the 30s through 50s. This movie more or less avoids that by making Anne Bancroft's character strong and interesting, and even at one point she even visits a hospital where she is more or less brushed away, which I think goes a long way towards sidestepping this sort of archetype of the hysteria that a lot of older movies would sort of fall into. But like I was saying, the sort of plot arc that they use to bring to set everything in motion, I guess you could say, is okay. It's related to the family, which is interesting. It does fall into this sort of contrived looking for a reason thing, but not too bad. The husband character in the movie, so Anne Bancroft's character is named Inga, which I'm not sure if that's just like some sort of Seattle has a lot of Swedish people in it, I guess. So we'll give her a Swedish name or something like that, perhaps. Her husband is not in the movie a lot. He plays a fisherman, but it's a sort of interesting character. Your first impression of him is a bit different from how he acts later in the movie, and he takes a number of different approaches to the issue, as does Anne Bancroft's character and Sidney Poitier. I think all the characters in the movie are given a little bit of room to breathe and to evolve in the story, which is kind of interesting. But you might jump to conclusions sort of early on. It's also, I will say, that this family-related thing that sort of spurs all the plot of the movie is something that today you might not think it's a big deal at all, and it might just seem totally ludicrous that somebody would be considering killing themselves because of this. And this is another moment where you just have to sort of find your bearings of your empathetic compass and understand when the sort of the context historically and things, why people would be upset about that at the time, which is easy enough to do because there's compelling acting, I think. But I think it's fair to say that the family drama is not the sort of focal point of the movie in some ways, and it's not exactly totally fleshed out, not exactly totally convincing, and in some ways does feel a bit contrived, and in some ways plays a little bit into this idea that suicide always has a distinct cause or something along those lines. So, all of that said, well, let's talk about the phones. So, one thing that's really cool about this movie is that while Sidney Poitier is talking on the phone, or while Alan Newell, his character, is talking on the phone to Inga, Alan Newell at one point also calls the switchboard operator to try to trace the call. And you see the whole procedure of this going on. There's sort of an interesting parallel that goes on. There's basically three stories happening at once in this movie. There's Sidney Poitier in the crisis center. There's Anne Bancroft's story through flashback. And then there are the switchboard operators in the phone company and the police trying to track down Inga in real life. And those are cut together fairly effectively to keep the story moving, although the movie does drag a fair amount, sort of, not exactly at the end, but sort of at the beginning of the last third of the movie, maybe. You think, you look at the time remaining, you think, that doesn't seem quite right. I thought we were closer to the end, which isn't exactly a mark of success. But the plot of the phone company and the police trying to locate Inga is really cool, to me at least. You see them go through the switchboard thing, go through all the rows and rows and rows of switches and trace the wires to try and figure out where the call is coming from. It turns out it's coming from a different switching center, so they have to get somebody out there. It's a really interesting perspective into the technology of phones at the time. Because so much of this movie takes place over the phone, that does limit in some ways some of the things that you can do dramatically, but it also kind of sets the stage in other ways, you know what I mean? Where it's really giving Sidney Poitier a platform to really act his heart out just as a guy talking on the phone. In some ways, a bit theatrical at times, definitely monologue-y, right? There's big portions of the movie that are sort of a monologue from one character or another, which more or less works out because Anne Bancroft and Sidney Poitier are really, really, really good in this movie. They take those monologues. Well, there's maybe one or two that seem slightly overwrought or cheesy. Like I said, the movie is maybe slightly overlong. There's maybe one or two that aren't necessary, but in general, the relationship that those characters build is interesting. There are a couple of Hollywoodisms here and there. For instance, Alan Newell, Sidney Poitier's character, who is by the way, a student who is apparently not totally trained, which I'm not really sure if this is how it works at these sort of hotlines or if it was in the 60s, but there are a number of things he does and says that don't seem exactly sort of by the book, which is interesting, and it's a bit hard to know if that's just because the movie's old or if it was unrealistic even then. His character didn't make that much sense even then as an sort of not very well-trained hotline person. There are also a couple of moments that are Hollywood sort of storytelling devices. For instance, there are a number of times when he tells Anne Bancroft how much longer she might be able to expect to live. And, it's like 40 minutes. You may have 40 minutes left. And that's basically just like the good old suspense building countdown timer. And I think it's very unlikely that you would discuss that in real life. But, whatever. You can sort of live with that to some extent. It does stick out a little bit. There are some moments like that. But in general, this is a pretty solid movie. Let me mention one other interesting thing about it, which is that there's a couple of times where you definitely notice that it's a movie from the 60s. So a lot of what I've described is maybe sort of borderline classic Hollywood thing that could have been made in the 50s to some extent. Like I said, views on suicide would have been a little bit different, and I think that Anne Bancroft's character would have maybe been a little bit weaker and less sympathetic, maybe, if the movie was older. But one place where it really shines in terms of the 60s nature coming out is there are really two different places. One of them is a really interesting scene where Anne Bancroft's character, Inga, and her husband go to a discotheque. And it's funny because they introduce it as, hey, there's this new place that George told me about it. What's it called, George? A discotheque, says George. So it's a new term for it. They've never heard of this discotheque thing. They're not really sure what it's all about. But they go, and you get a great scene of like 60s music and dancing at like the 60s nightclub discotheque thing that is in some ways a bit out of place in the movie. It's not exactly clear what the role of this scene in the movie is, if they're just trying to stick in a hip thing so that the movie is more with it or with the times or something like that. That said, the scene is not useless. You do get I don't want to go through the whole story exactly, but you do build, there is a dramatic value to that scene in the way that it builds the relationship, or builds on the relationship. The way the relationship between Inga and her husband is developed, I guess, in that scene, that happens to some extent. So it's not totally useless, but it is a little bit odd. So that's one sort of 60s thing of it that's I am sort of ambivalent about. There's another sort of 60s element that I think is pretty cool, which is that there are a number of scenes that take place out on a beach. And these are much more sort of not really surreal, but a little bit sort of bordering on Twilight Zone-y type aesthetic to some degree. Anne Bancroft's character sort of out on the beach. She's thinking about her life, and there's some just sort of interesting, somewhat metaphorical moments there. Some of them fall a little flat, maybe, but it's kind of interesting stylistically. And like I said, another signpost that this is a movie from the 60s, not the 50s. And overall, I think those scenes do add something. Who knows what? But they do add something to the movie. So overall, like I said, I think this is a pretty good movie. Maybe a little bit overlong. Fantastic acting, but a really cool view of Seattle at the time. And a nice little overview of telephones. So I think potentially worth watching if you like either of those things. But again, an interesting movie to see Sidney Poitier starring in a movie that is not a sort of morality play about race. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with those, but it's interesting to see him just in sort of a more standard movie in some ways, or not exactly standard, but you know what I mean. Anyway, so that's The Slender Thread, directed by Sidney Pollack. This is his debut film, by the way, as a director, that is, with Sidney Poitier, Anne Bancroft, and Telly Savalas from 1965. Maybe check it out. It's pretty cool.